You
channels.
don't really
This is
understand
completely
ownership until
unacceptable.
you watch
The
someone lose
association requires
access to something
immediate
they
access
thought
to
was
the lake.
theirs.
You need
The
to
first
move.
sound was the
I
lock
understand your
system
position.
engaging, a sharp metallic click echoing across the still water like a starting gun. Then another, and another, until the entire
As
shoreline
president
fell
of the
silent
association,
except
I
for the
want to be
soft
clear.
slap of
The
waves
rules
against empty
regarding
docks.
property
I
upkeep
stood
will
at the
be
control
strictly
panel with the
enforced
faint
starting next
smell of
month.
lake water and
This
machine
proposal is
oil rising in the
unacceptable. You
morning
cannot
heat.
build that structure
Watching
without a
as
variance.
37
Page
lake
42
houses
clearly
woke up
outlines
to a
the existing
reality
easement
they
rights.
weren't
We are
prepared
fully
for.
compliant.
Garage
This
doors
whole
opening,
section needs to be
footsteps
replaced
rushing,
immediately. It's a
confused
major
voices.
safety hazard.
Carrying across the
Repairs
water
alone
as
will
one by
exhaust our
one they
contingency
realized
fund.
the gates weren't
There we
responding.
go, access restored.
Keypads flashing red. Boat lifts frozen
Thank you.
midair
The
like they've been
community
caught
appreciates
doing
it.
something wrong. Linda Carver's voice cut through it all, sharp and controlled at first, then cracking at the edges as she jabbed her finger at the locked marina entrance like it had personally betrayed her. "This is illegal," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Like volume alone could rewrite ownership, and I could still smell her perfume from where I stood the night before in that HOA meeting room. That artificial sweetness that clung to the air long after the conversation turned sour. I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to, because everything that mattered had already been decided long before this moment. Long before the $63,500 repair bill hit their inbox and got dismissed like it was junk mail. Long before they stood around a polished conference table and voted unanimously that the damage to my dock system was shared community wear and tear. Long before Linda smiled that tight, rehearsed smile and told me, "We all benefit from the lake, Ethan, so we all share the responsibility." As if responsibility worked like a buffet you could walk away from when the bill showed up. The memory still sat heavy in my chest. Not anger, not exactly. More like a slow, steady pressure, the kind you feel right before a storm breaks. Because I knew something they didn't, something buried in documents they'd never bothered to read, something tied to every inch of shoreline, every dock, every access road leading down to the water. I watched a man in a fishing shirt punch his code 3 times before slamming his hand against the keypad, the dull thud carrying farther than he probably expected, and behind him a woman stood with her arms crossed, staring at the chain across the gate like it had no right to be there, like inconvenience itself was a violation. I could hear boat engines trying to start, then stopping when nothing moved, the low hum fading into frustration, and for a second the entire lake felt different, quieter, like it was finally back under the control it had always belonged to. Linda turned toward me then, her heels crunching against the gravel as she closed the distance, her expression shifting from authority to something sharper, more desperate. "You can't lock residents out of their own property," she said, each word clipped and precise. And I remember thinking how confident she sounded, how certain, like she'd never once considered the possibility that she might be wrong. I let the silence sit for a moment, felt the weight of every eye on me, every expectation, every assumption they'd built over months of treating me like a problem that needed managing instead of a person who actually understood what they were dealing with. And then I looked past her, out over the water, at the docks they'd used, the system they'd relied on, the access they'd taken for granted, and I finally said it, calm and steady. "It's not your property, because the truth is, it never was." And the locks were just the first thing they noticed. I bought my first piece of this shoreline when I was 28 years old, back when the only thing here was a narrow gravel path, a sagging wooden dock, and a stretch of quiet water that nobody thought was worth much. I remember the crunch of that gravel under my boots the first time I walked it, the smell of wet cedar from the old dock mixing with the clean, sharp scent of the lake, and my father standing beside me with his hands in his pockets, nodding once like he already knew I was going to say yes before I even opened my mouth. He built that original dock himself 2 summers later, every board measured twice, every bolt tightened by hand, the kind of work that does not show off but never fails. And over the years I expanded it piece by piece, adding reinforced pilings, electrical lines for lifts, and eventually the gated access system that now stood between 37 homeowners and the water they thought they owned. I did not inherit control by accident. I engineered it, documented it, and filed it the way you are supposed to when you actually respect property lines and water rights, something Linda and her board treated like optional reading. When the development started creeping in about 10 years ago, they came to me with polite smiles and neatly printed proposals, asking for easements, access agreements, shared usage, All the language that sounds cooperative until you read the fine print. And I remember sitting across from a younger version of Linda, still rehearsing that same smile, telling me how this community would increase value for everyone, how the lake would become a centerpiece, how we could all benefit if I just allowed controlled access through my land. I agreed, but only on my terms, because I had seen enough projects go sideways to know that control without clarity turns into chaos fast. So I wrote everything into the agreement, every gate, every dock connection, every inch of shoreline access tied back to a single system that I owned and maintained, and more importantly, that I could suspend if the terms were violated. They signed it, of course, because at the time they needed me more than I needed them. And for years it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Quiet mornings with boats easing into the water, families treating the place like it mattered, invoices paid on time without arguments. But something shifted when the houses filled up and the board realized they had numbers on their side. Meetings got louder, decisions got faster, and the tone changed from cooperation to control, like they had convinced themselves that repetition could turn access into ownership. I noticed it in small things first: unauthorized contractors working near the dock lines, minor modifications done without notice, emails that sounded less like requests and more like instructions. And every time I pushed back, Linda would lean on that same phrase, community asset, like saying it enough times would make it true. The night everything broke, literally and legally, started with a storm rolling in from the west, low thunder carrying across the water, wind picking up just enough to make the surface ripple. And I remember checking the system logs from my office when I saw the alert: pressure irregularity on the main dock line. The kind of thing that does not happen unless someone has been where they should not be, touching equipment they do not understand. And by the time I got down there, the damage was already done: support beams twisted out of alignment, electrical conduits exposed, sections of the docks sagging into the water like a structure that had simply given up. The smell hit first: burnt wiring mixed with lake water, and then the silence. That heavy kind that tells you something expensive just happened. And as I stood there looking at what used to be a system I trusted, I already knew this was not going to be a simple repair, and more importantly, I knew exactly who was going to try to pretend it was not their problem. I did not have to guess who touched that system, because people who do not understand infrastructure always leave fingerprints in the details. And the details were everywhere once I started looking: fresh tool marks on the access panel screws, insulation stripped too clean on a section of conduit that had never needed servicing, and the faint smell of cheap adhesive where someone had tried to patch something they had no business opening in the first place. I pulled the system logs from the control unit, and the timestamps lined up perfectly with a maintenance window that I never approved. A block of time labeled as community improvement access in an email I had ignored 2 days earlier, because it came buried in a thread full of decorative landscaping updates and pool furniture discussions, the kind of noise they used to hide decisions that actually mattered. By sunrise the next morning, I had a full picture of what happened. The HOA had hired a third-party contractor to install additional lighting along the dock for what Linda had proudly called enhanced evening aesthetics, and somewhere between drilling mounts and rerouting low-voltage lines, they hit the primary control feed that regulated both the lift motors and the safety cutoff system, a mistake that cascaded through everything connected to it, overloading circuits, destabilizing the dock supports, and turning a controlled system into something unpredictable. I stood there with a clipboard in one hand and my phone in the other, documenting every inch of damage, while the lake stayed unnaturally still, like it was waiting for someone to admit what they had done. And I remember thinking how quiet it felt without the usual hum of equipment. No gentle whir of lifts, no soft click of relays cycling, just the distant sound of wind brushing across the water and the occasional creak of stressed wood shifting under weight it was not designed to carry anymore. By mid-morning, I had already called in a structural specialist and an electrical crew I trusted. People who did not guess, people who measured, calculated, and told the truth even when it cost more than anyone wanted to hear. And when the estimate came back, it was not a surprise: $63,500, itemized down to the last bracket. Every number backed by code requirements and safety compliance. Not inflated, not negotiable, just real. I sent the invoice the same way I send everything important: documented, time-stamped, and impossible to misinterpret, addressed directly to the HOA board with copies attached of the access agreement they signed years ago. The section highlighted that clearly stated liability for unauthorized modifications resulting in damage to shared infrastructure systems. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought they would handle it the way reasonable people do when they make an expensive mistake. That illusion lasted less than 24 hours. The reply came in the form of a meeting request scheduled for that same evening. Labeled as urgent discussion, which in their language usually meant they had already decided the outcome and just needed a room to announce it. I walked into that clubhouse with the same folder I carried everywhere, the weight of it familiar in my hand, and the air inside smelled like polished wood and overbrewed coffee, the kind that sits too long on a burner, and Linda was already at the head of the table, posture perfect, expression composed, surrounded by board members who looked more annoyed than concerned, like the real inconvenience was having to talk about something that did not fit neatly into their idea of community control. She waited until everyone was seated before speaking, her voice smooth, practiced, carrying just enough authority to sound final before any discussion even started. And when she said the words shared responsibility, I knew exactly how this was going to end, not with accountability, not with understanding, but with a decision that assumed they could redefine ownership simply by agreeing with each other. And that was the moment I stopped thinking about how to fix the damage and started thinking about how to remind them what they had signed. The meeting room lights hummed faintly overhead, that low electrical buzz you only notice when everything else has gone quiet, and I could feel every pair of eyes tracking me as I set the folder down on the polished table, the surface reflecting just enough to make it look like there were twice as many people in the room. Linda did not wait for introductions or formalities. She leaned forward slightly, fingers laced together, posture controlled like she had practiced this moment, and said, "We reviewed your invoice," in that same calm tone she used when she wanted something to sound reasonable even when it was not, and I could already hear the outcome in the way she paused before the next sentence, like the decision had been made long before I walked in. I opened the folder anyway, sliding copies of the report across the table, each page crisp, each number grounded in code compliance and safety requirements. And for a second nobody touched them, like ignoring the paper might make the problem smaller, until one of the board members finally flipped a page with a soft rustle that sounded louder than it should have. "This kind of damage," I said, keeping my voice even, "does not happen without unauthorized work." And I tapped the section that outlined the exact failure point, the same line their contractor had drilled through without understanding what it carried. But Linda only smiled, small and tight, and shook her head just enough to signal disagreement without actually engaging with what I had said. "Ethan," she replied, drawing my name out like she was explaining something simple. "The lake is a shared community feature." And there it was again, that phrase, repeated like it had legal weight, like saying it enough times could override a signed agreement. And I could see a few heads around the table nodding along, not because they understood, but because it was easier to agree than to challenge the person running the room. I let the silence sit for a moment, then reached into the folder and pulled out the access agreement, sliding it forward so the highlighted sections caught the light. "Shared access," I corrected, tapping the clause that defined it in plain language. Not shared ownership and not shared liability avoidance. And for a brief second, I saw something flicker in one of the board members' expressions, recognition maybe, or doubt. But it disappeared as quickly as it came when Linda leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly, like she was done entertaining the discussion. "We are not approving this bill," she said, flat this time. No softness left, and the room shifted with that statement. Chairs creaking slightly, someone clearing their throat, the quiet sounds people make when they realize a line has just been drawn. I could smell the coffee again, stale and bitter, sitting in a carafe at the end of the table. And it reminded me how long these meetings tend to drag when people argue about things they should have read months ago. But there was no argument coming from me, not tonight. "Then you are refusing responsibility for damages caused under your direction," I said, not raising my voice, just stating it clearly enough that nobody could pretend they misunderstood later. And Linda gave a small nod, like she was signing off on something routine. "We consider it general wear and tear associated with community use," she answered. And that was the moment. It settled, not as anger, not even as frustration, but as something quieter, more precise, the kind of clarity you get when a problem finally stops pretending to be complicated. I closed the folder slowly, The sound of the cover meeting the pages soft but final, and as I stood up, I could feel the weight of every clause they had ignored. Every condition they had assumed did not apply to them, and I realized they were not trying to avoid the bill. They were betting that I would not enforce the part of the agreement they never took seriously. I looked at Linda one last time, her expression steady, confident in the way people are when they think control comes from consensus, and I simply said, "Understood," because there was nothing else left to discuss in that room. Not when the real conversation was written years ago in a document they had just decided to ignore. And as I walked out into the cooler night air, the faint smell of the lake carrying through the breeze, I was already thinking about the system they depended on, the one they used every day without ever considering who actually controlled it. And for the first time since the damage happened, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I did not go home after that meeting, not right away, because decisions like that do not come from emotion. They come from clarity, and clarity needs quiet. I drove down to the service access road instead, tires crunching slowly over gravel that had not changed in decades. The same path I had walked with my father when we first mapped out where the control system would sit. Back when the idea of needing gates and locks felt almost unnecessary, like overkill for a place that was supposed to be simple. The air was cooler by the water, carrying that clean, mineral smell the lake always had at night. And as I stepped out, the faint hum of the control unit was still there, steady and reliable, like it had no idea what kind of decision had just been made about its future use. I unlocked the panel with the same key I had carried for years, the metal worn smooth along the edges from use. And inside everything looked exactly the way it should, clean wiring, labeled circuits, the kind of order that only comes from people who respect systems instead of improvising around them. I ran my fingers lightly along the main control interface, not to change anything yet, just to confirm what I already knew, that every gate, every dock lift, every access point tied back here, to this one system, and more importantly, to my authorization. People like Linda thought control came from votes and meetings and raised hands around a table, but real control was quieter than that. It lived in infrastructure, in permits, in signatures filed years ago that nobody bothered to revisit until they needed something. I pulled up the access logs again, scrolling through entries that told a very simple story. Every entry point used, every code entered, every override attempted. And there it was, the unauthorized maintenance window, stamped with a contractor ID that did not belong to anyone I had approved, tied directly to the time the damage started, a clean line from action to consequence. That did not need interpretation. I took a breath, slow and steady, and for a moment I considered what they expected me to do next: send another email, schedule another meeting, try to explain something they had already chosen to ignore, and the thought felt heavier than it should have, like lifting something that had no intention of moving. Instead, I reached into my folder and pulled out the printed agreement again, not because I needed to reread it, but because holding it there, under the low light of the panel, made something very clear. Every clause was written for this exact moment. Every condition laid out not as a threat, but as a structure for what happens when one side stops honoring the terms. The section on access suspension was short, almost understated, just a few lines that most people would skim past, but it was precise, tied directly to unpaid liabilities and unauthorized modifications that compromise system integrity, the kind of language that does not argue it, simply defines. I closed the panel slowly, the latch clicking into place with a sound that felt different now, more deliberate, and as I stood there looking out over the dark water, I could see faint lights from the houses reflecting on the surface, small points of comfort that depended entirely on something they had decided not to respect. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, a message from one of the board members, probably trying to soften the decision, to reopen the conversation they had just closed, but I did not check it, not yet, because this was no longer about discussion, it was about enforcement. I walked back to my truck. The night quiet except for the distant sound of water moving against the shoreline. And I knew that by morning, everything would look the same from a distance. Same houses, same lake, same routines. But the one thing they had never really noticed, the system that made all of it possible, that was about to remind them exactly who it belonged to. The morning came in quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over the lake just before people start moving. before engines turn over and doors open and routines take over, without anyone thinking twice about how any of it works. I was already at the control panel before the first light broke across the water, the air cool enough that you could see your breath for a second if you exhaled slowly. And the faint hum of the system felt louder in the silence, steady and patient, like it had been waiting for instructions it had not received yet. I unlocked the panel and powered up the main interface, the screen flickering to life with that soft glow that always reminded me of early mornings spent testing circuits with my father, methodical, deliberate, no shortcuts, because shortcuts are what create problems like the one sitting in front of me now. I did not rush. There was no reason to. Every action needed to be exact, every command recorded, so I started with documentation, pulling up the incident log, attaching the damage report, the invoice, the timestamps from the unauthorized contractor access, building a record that would hold up anywhere it needed to, not because I expected a fight, but because I always prepare for one. The cursor blinked once as I opened the access control settings, and for a second I just watched it, that small, steady pulse of light that represented a system waiting for a decision. And I thought about the meeting, about Linda's voice when she said they were not approving the bill, about the way the board nodded along like agreement could replace obligation, and then I moved forward. The first step was not the lockout, not yet. It was the notice, because enforcement without notice turns into argument, and I had no interest in arguing. So I drafted it carefully, each sentence clear, direct, and grounded in the agreement they had signed, stating the unpaid liability, the unauthorized modifications, and the immediate requirement for resolution. And at the bottom, exactly where it needed to be, I included the clause, the one they had ignored, the one that defined what happened next if the terms were not met. I sent it to every registered homeowner and every board member at the same time. No delays, no staggered delivery. Because transparency matters when you are about to enforce something people pretend does not exist, my phone started vibrating within minutes. Messages stacking one after another, confusion first, then questions, then the kind of tone that tries to sound polite while pushing responsibility away. But I did not respond, not immediately, because the system does not respond to noise, it responds to conditions, and those conditions had not changed. I waited, watching the lake slowly come to life, lights turning on in the houses, silhouettes moving behind windows, the familiar rhythm of a community waking up to what they thought was just another day. And then the responses from the board came in, shorter, more controlled. Linda's message at the top, stating that the board would review the notice and respond in due time. The same language they used when they wanted to delay without committing. And that was the confirmation I needed. I navigated to the enforcement settings, each menu opening with a soft click. Each option exactly where it had always been, nothing hidden, nothing complicated, just a system doing what it was designed to do. And I selected the access suspension protocol, the one tied directly to unresolved liability, the one that did not require permission once the conditions were met. My finger hovered for a moment over the confirmation command, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what it represented, because once this was done, there was no pretending the agreement did not matter, no more meetings to reinterpret what had already been defined, just a clear line between access and ownership. I pressed the command, and the system responded instantly, a series of confirmations scrolling across the screen as each gate, each dock, each entry point shifted status from open to restricted and out across the water, barely visible in the early light. I could already see the effect, small movements turning into pauses, routines interrupted by something they had never had to think about before, and as I closed the panel and stepped back, the lake looked exactly the same as it had the day before, calm, open, unchanged. But for the first time in a long time, the control behind it was exactly where it had always been supposed to be. The first real sound of it spreading was not shouting, not at first. It was confusion, the kind that carries across water in broken pieces, a boat engine turning over and then cutting out, a keypad beeping twice before going silent, footsteps on wood that stopped too abruptly like someone had just realized the ground beneath them was not as solid as they thought. I stayed where I was for a while, leaning against the side of my truck with the early sun just starting to burn off the thin layer of mist over the lake, watching as the pattern unfolded exactly the way I knew it would, one house at a time, one dock at a time, each person running into the same invisible boundary they had never noticed before. A man in a navy windbreaker walked down his dock with a coffee mug in his hand, pressed his code into the panel without even looking, and when nothing happened, he tried again, slower this time. Like the system might respond better if he was patient, but the red light blinked the same way, steady and indifferent. And I could see the moment it registered, the slight tilt of his head, the pause, the glance back toward his house like maybe someone inside could explain what he could not. Further down the shoreline, a couple stood next to their boat lift, keys in hand, talking in low voices that carried just enough for me to hear the word broken, because that is always the first assumption, that something must be malfunctioning. Because systems like this are supposed to work, they are not supposed to make decisions. My phone started ringing again, not messages this time. Actual calls, names I recognized from the homeowner list flashing across the screen, one after another, and I let it ring, not out of spite, but because there was nothing to explain that had not already been explained in writing. About 15 minutes in, the tone shifted, confusion giving way to urgency, voices louder now. Someone calling across the water asking if anyone else was having trouble, and the answer came back almost immediately. Yeah, same here, it is not working, and just like that it was no longer an individual inconvenience. It was a shared problem, the kind that forces people to look for a central cause. That is when Linda showed up, her SUV pulling up. Faster than usual, tires kicking up small clouds of dust as she stepped out. Phone already in her hand, posture tight, controlled but not calm, and she moved with purpose down toward the main gate like she expected the system to correct itself the moment she arrived. I could hear her before I could make out the words clearly. That same authoritative tone, sharper now, directed at no one and everyone at the same time. Asking who authorized this, asking what was going on, asking questions that had already been answered in the notice sitting in her inbox. She punched in the master code she had used 100 times before, the one tied to her position on the board, and when the keypad flashed red instead of green, there was a brief pause, just long enough to break the rhythm of her certainty. And then she tried again, slower, more deliberate, like precision could override restriction, but the result did not change. I pushed myself off the truck and started walking toward the gate, not in a hurry, just steady, the gravel crunching under my boots loud enough to announce I was there without needing to say anything. And as a few heads turned in my direction, I could see the realization starting to form, not fully, not yet, but enough that the questions were beginning to point in the right direction. Linda turned as I got closer, her expression shifting from frustration to something more focused, more direct, and for the first time that morning, her voice was aimed at me, not the system, not the crowd, but me. Ethan, what is this? She demanded, not asking, not really. Because she already knew the answer, she just did not like what it meant, and I stopped a few feet from the gate, the locked chain between us catching the sunlight just enough to draw attention to itself, and I could feel the weight of every assumption they had made settling into something heavier, something harder to ignore, because for the first time, the system was not just something they used, it was something standing between them and what they thought they had access to. For a moment, nobody moved. Like the entire shoreline had paused to see who would speak first, and Linda held my gaze with that same controlled expression. But there was something different underneath it now, something tighter, less certain, like the situation had shifted just enough to make her recalculate. You need to unlock this immediately, she said, her voice firm, projecting authority toward the small crowd that had started to gather, homeowners standing a few steps back, watching, listening, trying to piece together what was happening without fully stepping into it. And I could hear the water behind them, steady, unchanged, a quiet reminder that nothing about the lake itself had been taken away, only the access they had stopped appreciating. I did not raise my voice, did not step closer, I just reached into my folder and pulled out a single sheet, the same notice I had sent hours earlier, and held it where she could see it, the highlighted section catching the light. Again, I already did what I needed to do, I said, calm, direct, and for a second she did not respond, her eyes scanning the page like she was seeing it for the first time instead of ignoring it the night before. This is a maintenance issue, she said finally, shifting her stance slightly, redirecting the narrative the way she always did. You cannot just shut down community access because of a disagreement. And there it was again. That word disagreement, like the damage, the invoice, the documentation were all just opinions instead of facts, and I could feel the weight of every homeowner listening, waiting to see which version of reality would hold. It is not a disagreement, I replied, keeping my tone even. It is an unresolved liability tied to unauthorized modifications to a controlled system, and I tapped the clause with my finger, not aggressively, just enough to anchor the words to something they could not dismiss as easily as they had in that meeting room. One of the homeowners stepped forward then, a man I recognized from the marina slips. His expression caught somewhere between frustration and concern. "We pay our dues," he said, not accusing, just stating what he believed should matter, and I nodded once, because I understood where he was coming from. But that did not change the structure of what had been. Signed, "Dues do not override ownership," I said, and the words seemed to settle heavier than anything else I had said that morning, because they cut through the assumption everything here operated on the same level. Linda exhaled sharply, the controls slipping just enough to show the pressure underneath. "We will review this with legal," she said, like that would reset the situation. Like time was something she could use to push this back into a conversation instead of a consequence, and I gave a small nod, not dismissive, just acknowledging. "You can review anything you want," I answered. "The agreement already defines the outcome." And I let that sit there, not as a threat, just as a fact. Behind her, someone tried their code again, the keypad flashing red in that same steady rhythm, and the repetition of it, that simple refusal to change, started to carry a different meaning, not malfunction, not inconvenience, but enforcement. Linda looked back at the gate, then at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she hesitated, not long, just enough to break the flow of certainty she relied on, and I could see it register, not fully, but enough, that this was not something she could talk around, not something she could vote away, because it was not built on agreement, it was built on structure. "What do you want?" she asked then, quieter now, the edge still there but directed, focused, and I did not need to think about the answer, because I had already written it, already sent it, already anchored it in the only place that mattered. "Resolve the liability," I said. "Pay the full amount, cover the repair, and restore the system to compliant condition." And I held her gaze as I added the last part, the one that mattered more than anything else. "Then access is restored." And the simplicity of it hung there, heavier than any argument, because it removed everything else they had been relying on, leaving only the terms they had agreed to and the choice they had just been forced to see clearly for the first time. The payment did not come that morning, and it did not come the next day either, because people who are used to control rarely let go of it quickly, even when the structure around them makes it clear they already have. Instead, what came first were calls from attorneys, carefully worded emails asking for clarification that was already written in plain language, and a second meeting request marked urgent again. Like urgency could change the terms that had been in place for years, and I declined. It the same way I decline anything that tries to replace documentation with discussion by not engaging with it at all. The lake settled into a different rhythm over those 2 days, quieter, not empty, but restrained, like a place waiting for permission that had never been questioned before, and the sounds changed in small ways. Fewer engines, fewer footsteps on docks, more voices carrying across the water asking what was going on and when it would be fixed, and every time, the answer traced back to the same point, the same condition that had not been met. By the third day, the pressure shifted, not toward me, but inward, toward the board itself, because inconvenience has a way of focusing attention faster than any document ever could, and homeowners started asking questions that could not be redirected, questions about liability, about agreements, about why something they had been told was a shared asset was suddenly inaccessible. I saw Linda less during that time, her presence replaced by emails from legal counsel that sounded more measured, less certain, like they had finally read what she had chosen to ignore. And when the official notice came through acknowledging the validity of the clause, it was not dramatic, it was just precise, confirming what had always been there. The payment arrived later that afternoon, not partial, not negotiated, the full amount, $63,500, along with an additional line covering inspection and compliance verification, because once a system is compromised, you do not just fix what is broken, you prove that everything works the way it should again. I stood at the same control panel where all of this started, the late sun reflecting off the water in long, steady lines, and processed the confirmation the same way I process everything, methodically, verifying the transfer, documenting the resolution, updating the incident record so that there was no version of this story that could be rewritten later. When I initiated the restoration protocol, the system responded the same way it always had, quietly, efficiently, each gate unlocking, each access point shifting back to open status without hesitation and out across the lake. The change was almost immediate, movement returning, engines starting, the low hum of equipment coming back to life. Like it had only been paused, Linda approached again as the main gate cycled open, her posture composed, but different now. Not weaker, just more measured, like she understood something she had not before, and for a moment she looked like she might say something. Maybe an apology, maybe a justification, but she did neither. She just gave a short nod. The kind people give when they realize the structure they tried to control was never theirs to define. I watched the homeowners return to their routines, codes entering green instead of red, docks filling with quiet activity, and the lake settling back into the pattern it had always had, unchanged on the surface, but not entirely the same, because now there was an understanding that had not been there before. I closed the panel one last time, the latch clicking into place with that same clean, final sound, and as I looked out over the water, I thought about how easy it is for people to confuse access with ownership, to assume that because something is available, it belongs to them. But systems do not work on assumptions. They work on structure, on agreements, on conditions that do not change just because someone decides they should, and the truth is, the lake was always open. The water was always there. They just never noticed the line that defined who controlled the way they reached it until it was closed. And by the time it opened again, that line was a lot harder to ignore.